Hello, welcome to Science Gallery Dublin. My name is Zach Denfeld. I'm a researcher here at the gallery. I also teach a class called Idea Translation Lab for Trinity, where we're looking at the topic of field tests. That's the exhibition that's up. So if you haven't had a chance to see the show, please come back and see the field test exhibition, which will be on through June 5th. I'm really delighted tonight to invite back to Dublin Nicola Twilley. Nicola is someone that we've worked with over the last 4 years. When I started making art and collaborating on art about food and the life sciences 4 or 5 years ago, she reached out to me and asked me to write a blog post for a magazine she was working at, and since then we've continued the conversation. And she was also here last year to help us at Science Gallery Dublin think through the future of food and farming, so it's great to have her back. More of a solo talk this time. Last time was a conversation on stage, which was quite fun as well. What I love about Nikki's research is both its breadth and its depth, and she's generally fascinated in everything, not just food and farming, but even within that space, she manages to find the most interesting and bizarre stories from around the world, and there's a real breadth to the writing and broadcasting she's done, but also a depth. And I think tonight you'll get some sense of the ways she finds to talk to very unusual people and get into unusual places. And as an artist who's always looking at both academic literature as well as popular media, it's inspiring to see the just weirdest things that she finds around the world. So I guess tonight she'll be telling us not only about some of the personas and places, but also the process of how you report on these topics. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nicola Twilley.
All right, thank you, Zach. That was a lot to live up to. So even though this is more of a talk than last time's conversation, I hope it also will be a conversation. So if you have, we're going to have a lot of Q&A at the end. Also, if you have a burning question as I go along, just wave at me, because there's a mic there that Zach has that he'll bring. So yeah, we don't have to just listen to my voice. That might get a bit tedious. But it's lovely to be back here at Science Gallery. Thank you for coming along. It all started with a blog. That's a statement that probably I think only makes sense for something that, for maybe the first decade of the 21st century. I think things have changed enough now that solo blogs are not the launch pad that they were. I don't know if that's true, but what happened is I started a blog called Edible Geography, and that worked out very well for me. It was a lot of fun. My first post, it's a little bit blurred, but they're boxer shorts with cuts of meat on it. My first post was called Secret Meat, which goes to show that you can have a lot more fun writing on your own blog than you can for the mainstream media. But it was about a US butchery innovation to come up with new cuts of meat, and the idea that sort of the cuts of meat that we have, yes, they're partly determined by the sort of architecture of the animal, but you can look at it sort of like a sculpture, like, the way Michelangelo was sort of like, I look at the marble and, the angel sort of comes out to me. He had a pithier quote than that. But along those lines, imagine looking at the cow and seeing different cuts. So in any case, I started this blog in 2009, started writing about whatever I thought was interesting, little snippets here and there. It made me think more about the things I thought were interesting, because you can just put up a thing and be like, oh, I think that's interesting. But I never thought very much of that approach. Always thought I should sort of dig into why I thought it was interesting. Some of the longest blog posts on the internet are mine. But also it became an excuse to go and visit interesting places and people. And that is part of the fun of it. It also then started getting attention, which was quite interesting. So one of the first posts that did very well was about biscuit embossing. And you might not know this, but there's an entire conspiracy theory around the Oreo. that says, so that cross there, the one that's sort of like above the Oreo and is the two lines, that's the cross of Lorraine, which the Knights Templar carried into battle. And then the other crosses that go around in a circle, those four that look a bit like a clover, that's the croix pâté, which is associated with Freemasonry. So basically, the Oreo is some sort of secret power cookie that rules the world. But, I came across this obscure conspiracy theory, and then it turned into an entire post about why biscuit embossing, why do we do it, what are the patterns, how is it done, all of these sorts of things. There's actual practical reasons for doing it, etc. It affects the dunking capability. There's some, fluid mechanics going on. So, and that turned into a whole post that then the Economist picked up on, because obviously it's a serious topic. When you're talking about Freemasonry, the Economist has to get involved. So it sort of led to, getting noticed by these mainstream publications and opportunities to write for them, which was quite fun. It led to a residency at Mexico City's Central Market, which is the largest wholesale market in the world. And it led to, for example, working at the magazine where I encountered Zach. So it was all good, and that's how I think the reason I sort of start here is because really I have no training as a journalist, no background. Started out, my academic background is in history of art, which is about as useless as it can get. So it's all fake it till you make it, my career, and this is how I sort of got going. So I'm going to dive into 3 stories in particular, and just how I started them, how they came about, how I went about them, etc. And the first one is about refrigeration. So this started because my husband had a fellowship at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, and they were putting together an exhibition about military architecture. And one of the things they were looking at was what they called the architecture of the rear. And I was like, what is that? And they said, it's the supply chain, logistics, etc. And I said, that's interesting. I wonder what the architecture of the rear is for food. Well, the architecture of the rear for food is obviously a refrigerated warehouse. And once I started looking into refrigerated warehouses, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a giant third Arctic that we have built for our food to live in. And it's just because it's distributed rather than being one giant thing. We don't really think of it as this enormous kind of cold space that we built, but it is, and it's all connected. That's the point of the cold chain, as it were. So I started getting absolutely, completely obsessed. Did an exhibition with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which, if you don't know them, you should go and look them up after this talk. They're a great organization in Los Angeles that sort of document the American landscape and all its weirdness. So they'll look at like testing tracks and just do a whole exhibition on that. So we did an exhibition together about America's refrigerated spaces. And then this fella, Michael Pollan, patron saint of food, decided to launch a fellowship at UC Berkeley. So a food and farming journalism fellowship. And I thought, well, I'll apply for this. And what you had to do was send in a pitch. Well, at that point, I'd never actually written a pitch, and this might be something you're taught in journalism school, I hope so. I didn't go to journalism school, so I had no idea, but I Googled it, and there's plenty of good information online. So I wrote a pitch about refrigeration, and specifically about Chinese refrigeration. So after I had surveyed the landscape above American refrigeration, I thought, what about, is it other countries' artificial cryospheres, as I was calling it? And some places don't have the same sort of, America is the most refrigerated country in the world, so what does it look like elsewhere? And then I realized, as I started, you go down this rabbit hole of all these industry publications, refrigerated news and such like, and I realized there's a boom in China that's going on. They're refrigerating. The Chinese government had made it part of their 5-year plan, one of their top priorities for the 5-year plan was we will refrigerate. And I thought, when China does anything, it has quite a massive impact on the entire world, and probably the same when they refrigerate, but no one's writing about this because no one except for me thinks refrigeration is interesting. So I was like, this is my in. So I pitched this story and got into the fellowship, and it was very, very helpful, because what I did was I wrote, amazing, there's a boom in China and it will affect everyone, and I'll go to China and report it. That was my pitch. And that is not actually a good pitch, as Michael Pollan sort of made clear through the process of the workshop. Instead, what you have to do is find scenes and characters. And so I did that. It was great. I mean, it was quite a brutal workshop. We had to give our pitch verbally to sort of several editors that they had brought in from Wired and Harper's and the New Yorker, and all of them were just, made no bones about how incredibly boring my pitch was. And roughly where I got to the part about the 5-year plan, they were all like, and so I went away and tried to make it more interesting, and found a Chinese dumpling billionaire who could be my hero. He was the man who had brought frozen food to China, and he was a former surgeon and had so he'd worked with cold a lot as a surgeon. He knew his preservative powers, and he was famous for his homemade dumplings. And when Deng Xiaoping said, some of us will get rich, he was like, I'd like to be one of those people. How can I give my dumplings legs, was how he phrased it. And he decided that refrigeration was the way to give his dumplings legs, or specifically freezing. So I reframed my pitch around him, a sort of central character, and what are frozen dumplings. They turned out to be the sort of gateway drug for frozen food in China. Chinese people didn't really trust frozen food, but frozen dumplings, sort of. They had sort of cracked the market. And still, if you go to a Walmart in China, and you look at the frozen food department, which is tiny compared to its American counterpart, it'll be 80% frozen dumplings. And 80% of that 80% will be this guy's brand. And so I reframed the pitch around that, sent it off to the New York Times Magazine, where I knew the editor-in-chief liked my blog, which is a place where the blog had been handy. And he was like, this is ridiculous. You've never written for us. You've never written a piece this long. You've never been to China. And you want to do your first piece for the New York Times Magazine like that? I mean, are you insane? Why would we do this? Fortunately, the fellowship came with a travel stipend. So then I wrote to him and said, well, you won't have to pay for the travel at least. So if it doesn't work out, no loss on your part. And he was like, all right, in that case, go for it, and we'll see. There might be nothing. Anyway, so I went to China, and I traveled around to lots and lots of places. Actually, before I went to China, I then had my second panic. It's like, be careful what you wish for, because now I had the assignment, and I was like, well, wait, how am I going to report a story in China? I don't speak Chinese. I don't know how to call a dumpling billionaire. Would you, or email? Does he prefer text message? Who knows? So I was a bit sort of like, help. One of my best friends from school had lived in Beijing for a little bit, so I emailed her and was like, what shall I do? And she had made friends with someone while she was there who worked for Bloomberg, and that person connected me to a pool full of fixers. And these fixers are amazing. They're like these perfect English-speaking Chinese people who will just fix everything for you. Everything. They fixed my visa, which was a miracle because China hates the New York Times. He fixed all these visits. I went to the largest yogurt plant in China. That's on the top right there. Yogurt is the gateway drug for dairy as well. That's another thing where obviously China traditionally doesn't eat a lot of dairy, but everyone's like, but there's so many of them. If only we could get them to eat dairy. So yogurt is the sort of the push. That's like the gateway drug for dairy. And the way they market it is fascinating. There's all these pictures of girls with beautiful glowing skin holding a bottle of drinkable yogurt up to their face, because it's supposed, the way they market it is it's like perfect for your skin, which I suppose it's not bad for your skin, who knows? Or, I mean, if you drink it or put it on, I wasn't quite sure. But anyway, so I went all around, and again, because as the New York Times editor-in-chief had correctly pointed out, I didn't know what I was doing. So I went far too many places and interviewed far too many people because I didn't actually have any sense of what a story would look like. I just wanted to go and see interesting things. I went to see, this is in an agricultural research station, bottom right there, where they had this thing called the Room of the Sleeping Fish. They figured out how to send fish to sleep using refrigeration and then ship them in like poster tubes across the country, and then they'd come out alive the other end. Very strange. That's a wet market. Obviously, that's the sort of more traditional version, et cetera, et cetera. Came home. I'd been commissioned at 5,000 words, turned in 9,000. That's also not what you're supposed to do. That made me very unpopular. But my editor there was very patient with me, and it was almost like when you have talking with someone who has a terminal illness. It was a very caring phone call where he was like, we're going to have to cut this part out, and we're going to have to cut this part out, and we're going to have to cut this part out. And it was, he was cutting it in half, so it was a lot of cutting. And the final result was this, which the price of cold, online it's called What Do Chinese Dumplings Have to Do with Global Warming? Which is a much more clickbaity title, but in the magazine it was called The Price of Cold, which I preferred. And with that turned out to be sort of once you've been published in the New York Times Magazine, it turns out people take you a little bit more seriously. So that was a good thing. It also is now turning into a book about refrigeration. So if you still want to hear more about refrigeration, which you secretly know you do, I'm not going to disappoint you. So that brings me to my next story that I'm going to tell you about, which is one of my fellows on that Michael Pollan fellowship I told you about. We stayed in touch. She was called Cynthia Graber. She was another journalist who had, been chosen as a fellow. We would edit each other's work occasionally, et cetera, et cetera. And one morning she emailed me and said, do you want to read this? It's a proposal I've put together for a podcast. And I was in a really foul mood. I had arranged to go on a special secret tour of the new 2nd Avenue subway in New York that isn't open yet. And they had just finished blasting the caverns. And I had wangled my way onto it, and I was very excited. And due to a combination of my husband's ineptitude and several forms of transport breaking down on me, I had missed the tour. And so I was, I was not in a good place. So I read her proposal, and then I wrote back and I was like, well, you need a co-host. What about me? And she was like, oh, great idea. So we started Gastropod, which is a podcast that looks at food through the lens of science and history. And we started working in June, July 2014. The first episode came out in September 2014. We do know, and this is Science Gallery, so probably some of you in the audience are like, do you not know that gastropod means snail? We do know that gastropod means snail, but we also quite liked gastropod, kind of a podcast about things to do with food. Regularly, one email a week about that at least. So we do know. There was much to learn. This is me in my exciting home recording studio. So the first, yeah, it's not my underwear drawer, but it's close. So basically, when you're recording at home, what you want is to sort of dampen the sound. And initially, Cynthia, who actually has a background in radio, so she sort of knew what she was talking about, was like, get under your duvet. Well, it's August in New York at that point. You have to switch the air conditioning off, because that's obviously a lot of background noise right there. And then I'm under my duvet recording for an hour. And the first recording session I came out of the bedroom, and Jeff was like, did you take a shower? Dripping. but like, it was, I mean, yes, it was a sauna. So then I built this sort of, I hung my duvet over my closet and record in there. So there were many, many practical things to learn like that, but there were also lots of things to learn about how you think about things in sound. So this is Cynthia recording some seaweed having sex in a laboratory. Sounds almost as exciting as it looks. But you start having to, I had always been a writer, and this was an entirely new way of thinking for me. When you visit a scientist's lab, I'd be looking around thinking, how am I going to describe this in print? Now I had to look around and think, is there anything that will make a cool noise? Because it doesn't matter how cool it looks if it doesn't make a cool noise. So that was an entirely new way of thinking. We've developed this sort of whole process that I can go into in much more depth, but where we, in short, basically, generate the idea, spend some time researching it. There's another step, that's all like what you would do if you were writing a print story. Then there's another step that comes in, which is where you try to find any video of those people talking, or audio, anything, so you can see if they're a good talker. Because it doesn't matter if they're the most interesting person in the world. If they're a terrible talker, they are terrible for your show. So, and we have learned that the hard way. So you have that sort of step in there. Some people just sort of freeze up and aren't, and then it just isn't going to work, Then we go out and do interviews, and that's another thing. Again, that sort of is different. When you're doing a print story, if the person doesn't say precisely the thing you want them to say, you can write it, and then you can sort of use some other quotes of theirs, If the person doesn't say what you want them to say on tape, you can't use it. It's like, it's much more, you really need them to say the things as well. You can't go in there and, in many ways in print, often what you're trying to do is set people at ease. Like, I do know what I'm talking about, so you can open up and talk to me. Show you've done your research. So you often ask questions that reveal that you know something about the topic. And on the podcast, we need them to explain it. They need to be the ones explaining it. So we have to ask really stupid questions. So I often go in and I'm like, I do actually know but the answer to this, but, So it's a little, there's that, I haven't really worked out a good way around that. You just have to somehow, because it's alarming for experts a lot of times when you ask really stupid questions. They're like, oh God, what am I dealing with here? This person's going to make a mess of this story. So you want to calm them down that you know what you're talking about, but you don't want to seem as if you know what they're talking about, because otherwise they won't tell you the things you need. Dilemma. Anyway, once we have all those interviews done, we transcribe them, which is immensely painful, so that we have we call it tape logging, so that we have the times for everything. Then we go through and find all the good clips, and then we get on Google Docs together, and we have these 5-hour Skype conversations where we're both on Skype and Google Docs at the same time, and we just script the episode. And we always get to about halfway through, and we're like, oh, are we done yet? And we're not. And then we do a read-through, and that's where you discover all of the transitions you thought were so brilliant, and the things that you thought made sense don't. And then we record. We get in the closet. Cynthia gets under her duvet still, and we record. Then we mix it. So this is a story. I wanted to sort of tell you about one story in particular. And I think what I'll do is just play the clip first. So, there we go.
I don't really buy into this calorie is a calorie thing.
In the end, and I guess this is sort of treating it as a chemist, calorie is a calorie is a calorie. It's a unit of energy.
I think all calories are not the same when it comes to how satisfying they are.
You can't count calories anyway. It's not really possible for anybody who's just an eater to figure out how many calories you're eating.
Calorie is the only darn thing we've got in this game at the moment, isn't it? But it gives us a sort of unfair sense of precision. the calorie is a somewhat dangerous item because it leads us to thinking that we've solved the problems when in fact we haven't.
Hello and welcome back. This is the first episode of a new season of Gastropod, the podcast that looks at food through the lens of science and history. I'm Nicola Twilley.
And I'm Cynthia Graber. And I bet you listeners have no idea what we're going to be covering in this episode.
Seriously, if you can't guess already, then go and get yourself a coffee and take this again from the top.
Yes, that's right. We are not easing into things this season. We're stepping boldly into one of the thorniest food controversies of all, the calorie. What the heck is it? If you've ever tried to lose weight,
Hello, New Year's resolutions.
You'll know that the standard advice is you have to eat fewer calories than you burn. But we wanted to know, is a calorie the same no matter what type of food it comes from? And is 1 calorie for you exactly the same as 1 calorie for me?
Or me. We'll hear from all of the folks you just heard and more on this show as we visit the special rooms where calories are measured and the labs where scientists are busy proving that the numbers on our food labels are off, sometimes by quite a bit. So, is the calorie broken?
Listen in for more. But first, this week's show is a special episode brought to you in collaboration with Mosaic. That's the online publication of the Wellcome Trust.
So this was an episode we put out in January, and like you just heard, we collaborated with Mosaic for this one, which was great because that gave us some funding to actually travel to report it too. Although what wasn't so great is then we had to write an article to go with it, which is quite a bit of extra work. But anyway, so one of the things that is interesting, there are a few things that are interesting about, or that I learned having been a print journalist, and then trying to work in audio. First of all, I already write sentences that are too long in print. You can't do that when you're scripting for audio. Cynthia just goes along behind me as I type in the Google Doc and puts in full stops. She just follows along behind me, putting in full stops and starting a new sentence, because your sentences have to be, if it's longer than 7 words, you're going to trip up when you're recording it. So, and it's not going to make any sense. So like I say, there's some very practical things like that. Stats don't work very well. Like the minute you have more than 2 numbers in a sentence, everyone's just like, whoop, that happened. Something new every 40 seconds is what they say in with your audio sort of attention span. So that having a co-host is a dynamic that's quite interesting. So that's something, again, in print, you might be in the piece or you might not be in the piece, but either way, it's only you. When we're reporting Gastropod, we become, although we are Cynthia and Nikki, we become Cynthia and Nikki, and we're characters, basically. Which helps me get over the cringe effect, so listening to my own voice a little bit, because it's like, it's not me. It's Nikki, the co-host of Gastropod, as opposed to actually me, thank goodness. That now I'm sounding like I actually am slightly touched, but that's the way we think about it. And I do think, it's a sort of, people say that podcasts, one of the reasons they're successful is, it's very intimate relationship with the listener. You're often in their ear, in their earbuds, or in the car alone with them, just your voice, etc. And so you are a character, and they get to know, like we both bring our partners on every now and then, so they get to know a little bit about you. But it's not really you because you're, so that's it. But it works very interestingly because you can also do things where you can explain things. So I can ask Cynthia a question and stand in as a proxy for the listener that way, which is helpful. This was an episode we did about calories. Came about because I had bought a book about calories like 2 years ago and never read it. And so we were casting about for what to do. And I was like, this would be a good excuse to read that book. So I said, why don't we do something on calories? And Cynthia was like, well, that's interesting. And, pitched it, reported it, went down to Beltsville, Maryland to visit these rooms called calorimeters, where they do measure, they can measure, basically you go and live in these rooms for 24 or 48 hours, and they can measure exactly how many calories you've burned. Doing whatever you're doing. You're on a very rigorous schedule. They feed you a very rigorous amount of food. You have to provide all your waste as well. basically they have they have a special. Oh, did I do that? They have special coolers for you to carry your poo around it and turn it in for them to incinerate and measure how many calories are in it. They just sort of freeze dry it and then burn it and see how many calories are in it. But it's a very technical story, so it's very hard to bring to life. And so I'm going to play this next clip because this was another thing that sort of pretty much I had to learn by not doing, which is that you really have to get the person you're with to describe the place. Otherwise, you're not bringing it to life. So here we're standing in a calorimeter, and yeah. There we go. Oh. Or we're not.
We actually traveled to Beltsville, Maryland to visit the USDA calorimeters in person.
This is literally a walk-in cooler.
We bought this from Norlake, which is a walk-in cooler company, yeah. Because unlike a lot of them, they're nice. They're sealed fairly tight.
Bill Rumpler is a USDA researcher. He's the one that tricked out the walk-in coolers to turn them into calorimeters.
So we have a fold-up bed, a treadmill, a TV, a toilet.
Yeah, and then there's the access ports. We have in the doorway we have a airlock for passing food in and out or passing out non-biohazardous material like urinary blood samples. We wouldn't pass them out through the food locker. We have a blood port which a person could stick their arm out through. We can hook up a catheter or just simply pull their blood samples. They have internet access. We have a couple different ways people can exercise in here.
There are 3 of these rooms. They're about 10 foot by 10 foot, and they're pretty stark. Fluorescent overhead lighting, vinyl floor tiles, white walls, lots of exposed pipe and sensors. It sort of reminded me of a low-security prison.
People are shut in here for 24 to 48 hours. I imagine it gets kind of boring.
Well, I had a woman years ago that was in my study that brought her sewing machine, and she sat and made clothing while she was in there.
Got to come up with something, right?
Oh, you're allowed to bring, like if your hobby is knitting or whatever, you're allowed to bring?
We discourage sewing machines now. She made a mess.
We asked him, like, what can you do with a sewing machine that is so awful? Apparently she was using sequins, so I don't know. But you can see that's sort of a little example that gets it, we had to have that whole description because, you can't, there's no visual for a person otherwise. And the entire thing is sort of hinging around how do we measure calories? Well, we measure them by putting people in these weird little rooms and measuring how much, oxygen, carbon dioxide mix in the room. And so you have to really try to bring it to life in as far as you can. It's, there's a lot more to the podcast, and we can talk about it. One thing I would say, if any of you are thinking of doing it, there are 2 of us doing this. Something like Radiolab, which you might listen to, that has 13 dedicated people plus all the web and tech support of a station. So it's very, very. We made this very hard for ourselves. But we are gradually getting there. So we launched, like I say, in September 2014. When you get to about 50,000 downloads per episode, that's when advertisers want to start to work with you. So now we're actually, just about making enough for a sandwich a month each from advertising, and we did get some grant money and so on. So it's getting there. But it was not the easy life that I thought it might be. We just and of course everything breaks. So we put a new episode out today. It's all about caffeine. Totally fascinating. Did you know that the birth control pill affects how you metabolize caffeine? I did not. Also grapefruit and red meat. And you'll have to download the episode to find out more. But of course, our website goes down yesterday, and so I'm sitting in the JetBlue lounge that I'm not even actually allowed to be in, but I sort of pled with the guy so I could get online to try and talk with the hosting support company to try to get the episode out before I got here, and it didn't work. So then when I landed, which was 1 a.m. in the US, I got back on with the support company to try to... So it never... And this is why other places have like a whole station and a whole network and everything. And so the third story I'm going to tell you about really quickly is one I wrote for The New Yorker. So this guy is called Eustace Tilley. He actually has a name. And this is The New Yorker's mascot, which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about The New Yorker. It's a very odd publication. I had never heard of it actually growing up in England, and I think that probably makes me a complete Philistine, but I had never heard of it. And probably you are all much more educated than I am, and you have, but to me, when I discovered it, here's a magazine where you can read 10 pages about Chinese entrepreneurs selling lingerie in Egypt, and it's illustrated with cartoons. Like, what is this thing? I mean, there's nothing like it anywhere in the world. And as soon as I read my first copy, I was like, I want to write for them. It turns out that most other writers have the same idea. So it's quite a competitive business. Fortunately, again, this came out. You can see now how Michael Pollan is like my fairy godfather, because one of the editors on... I don't know if he'd appreciate being called a fairy godfather anyway, but one of the editors on that fellowship was an editor at The New Yorker, and he sort of sat down with me afterward and was like, oh, so have you done anything interesting lately? And me, being the idiot that I am, did not realize he was asking me to pitch him a story. And instead, I'm all like, la, 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 telling him about my summer. But he stayed in touch, and I became a contributing writer at The New Yorker in October 2014, which is very, 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 very exciting. It's not as exciting as becoming a staff writer. Staff writer is like sainthood, essentially, for writers, but I live in hope. They have given me my own avatar, which looks nothing like me, but this is like one of the things I'm proudest of in my entire writing career, because you only get to have one of these if you're, a New Yorker writer. So even though everyone who looks at it is like, who is that? So it's an odd and slightly terrifying place, but I was eventually assigned, and I've done most of my writing for them online. But I was eventually assigned a couple of print stories. The second one I was assigned ended up being the first one that came out, and it was a profile of Charles Spence, who some of you may have heard of. He is the man who became famous for an experiment involving Pringles. He showed that you can make Pringles taste 15%, stale Pringles taste 15% fresher by amplifying the crunch that they make when you bite into them. So, and it's a nifty setup, as you could see. He had this mic, so as you crunched, it went around in real time through an amplifier that made it a little more high-pitched and a little louder, and back into your ears that couldn't hear the crunch from inside your mouth. So basically, you got the amplified crunch in real time, and that's how he demonstrated this astonishing fact. And it, it won an Ig Nobel Prize, I think, at the time, which is, people wrote headlines like, "Why research this?" etc. It was sort of a bit of a laughing stock, especially since he's like a University of Oxford professor, and people were like, "And they're researching the crunch on Pringles. What does this have to do with anything?" But so I pitched a story about him, went and spent a week with him, and he's turned out to be a very funny man. His parents were travelers. They worked the fairgrounds, so his parents had never had a day's school. And then he's a University of Oxford professor. But of course, then I had to write the piece, wrote it in 48 hours. It was terrible. My editor gave it back to me and was like, well, you need to rewrite the beginning and middle, and there's substantial edits on the end. So that was basically like, try again, said nicely, which I did. And then the piece came out. And the thing I wanted to talk to you about with this story really quickly is The New Yorker is sort of famous for its fact-checking. It's legendary for its fact-checking as a sort of practice. And I had not experienced this until this story. And it is true. Like, for a week, me and the fact checker, I mean, we were texting, emailing, and talking at least 10 times a day. It was like the start of a really intense relationship, and then we haven't spoken since. And what's so interesting is a couple of the facts that I had gaily written thinking they were facts, that I had taken from scientific papers thinking they were facts, turn out not to be true. The actual scientists have gone back and corrected them. So there was one fact that I had that was like, Americans consume nearly 1/3 of their daily calories in food or drinks that are eaten straight from the package. This is in print. If you want, there are several books that cite this statistic, there are papers, etc. Turns out no one actually can back it up. The fact checker goes all the way back to the first instance of that in print, calls the person who is like, oh, I got it from a lecture that this guy gave, calls that guy, and the guy was like, oh, I was sort of speaking in a general way. So it turns out this entire body of knowledge that is in, and trend reporters and advertising packaging companies use this stat in all of their publications. I mean, it may be true, but it's not a fact in the New Yorker's eyes. So that got rewritten. And then there's a whole business of, people say flavor, it's mostly smell, right? It's not mostly your taste buds. People don't realize this. They think it's mostly your taste buds, but it's not. It's mostly something called retronasal olfaction, which happens, whatever, in your... I'm not going to explain retronasal olfaction. But the stat that is quoted is 80% of flavor is smell. Again, if you want to go and Google this, it is everywhere over the internet. I wasn't even breaking a sweat when we got to this one with the fact checker. I was like, it's true. Everyone says it's true. Turns out it's not true at all. And Charles Spence has now written a paper trying to track down where this myth came from, that's in and whether there's any truth to it, and what experiment would need to be done to find out whether it is true. Which just came out like a month ago. My piece came out in October. So this has inspired a whole new thing of scientific research. So yeah, the New Yorker fact-checking process is a thing. And then you have what's called a red pencil meeting, where you all go in and you're given the copy editor, your editor, and the fact-checker go in, sit around a table in silence, and you're given a copy of the galleys and a red pencil. And you all go line by line, and all the copies of the galley have to have exact same markings on them, and then you turn them in, and then they're done. So that was an experience as well. And the final thing I wanted to say about this is it says The Packaging King as the title. That wasn't the title in the end. This is for me, this is like a public service announcement. Journalists do not choose their titles. They do not. So whenever anyone complains about the title, or you tweet at someone like, oh, this title's stupid, rethink that, because the journalist did not choose it, their editor did. This was initially called something gastrophysics, then it was called The Packaging King, last I saw it. When it came out, it was called Accounting for Taste. So I had nothing to do with it, just so you know. But yeah, I'm working on a couple more pieces right now for the New Yorker, including quite an exciting one that involves freezing people. Obviously working on new gastropod episodes, including one about agricultural crime that I'm very excited about. And my blog hasn't died yet, but it's, slowly dying of neglect. But I'm going to stop right there and open it up for questions, because that's just sort of an intro to what I do, and yeah.
Thank you very much. That was great. There was a bio which I neglected to read, but you covered everything in the talk, so actually there's no need
perfect.
to. Is there anything else you wanted me to give a shout out from the bio? Okay, you cover everything. So yeah, any questions for Nikki? I have lots of questions, so if they're shy.
Hi. Can you get a book on the facts that the New Yorker discounted?
Well, I have to fulfill my first book contract first, which I'm getting nervous about already. But yeah, no, there is actually an excellent book called The Life History of a Fact, which is between a writer and his fact checker at Harper's Magazine. And I think I'm giving you the right title, but it's quite easy to find on the internet. And I think the writer wasn't American and wasn't used to the concept of fact checking. So, and it turns into this entire, like, how do you decide what is a fact? I mean, and it got to that stage with the New York Times, for example, with my cold piece. I had written a sentence about, the minute an apple is picked, it begins to rot, or something like that, which is true, but it's not rotten yet. It starts dying, but it's not rotten. And honestly, it was a half-hour conversation as to whether we could say the minute an apple is picked, it begins to rot. Because was it actually a fact that you start to get into this philosophical question of like what is a fact? And that's why that book is quite funny. The correspondence back and forth is because the fact checker really is checking these things that are uncheckable, but nothing is uncheckable for a fact checker. I don't know where they learn what they do. That would be an odd training.
Sure how to phrase this, but have you developed a successful approach to researching that has a pattern to it, where you say you ignore Wikipedia and the first page of Google research, or how do you get things that are interesting but not generic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it varies depending on what I'm doing. Where I've had a lot of success is trade publications. They are just these overlooked, like, treasure troves of fascinating things that on the surface look insanely boring, but are actually, the seeds of something completely brilliant. And also because they're really badly written generally, it's not like, and no one's read them, so it's not like, this has been covered. You can, make them your own. Someone hasn't necessarily seen the promise of automated logistics, but you can, So I spend a lot of time reading like Fruit Picker Monthly and, and various things like that, discovering I have alerts set up on patent picks because new patents are fascinating. People start to send you interesting things once at a certain point, once they know the kind of things that you cover, people send you things, which is nice. So there was one of our episodes on gastropod was about this phase in American history where America put bulls on trial, had these mock trials, and it was supposed to, sort of unfortunate, it was slightly tied in with the eugenics movement, but it was supposed to sort of be an American initiative to improve the nation's cattle stock by not allowing so-called scrub bulls, or basically crappy bulls, to breed. And so the USDA put out these pamphlets with suggestions, have a mock trial, put the bull in the dock. They would always end with a barbecue, which was the unfortunate bull itself. It was amazing. And this was a USDA sort of mock trial pamphlet with language. And you could put it on at the county fair or whatever. Sweet. But someone just sent me that. So I would never have found that. This was like, you might be interested in this, which what that says about me is that. But yeah. But Wikipedia is actually quite a great thing, especially for science. For some reason, I've ended up covering a lot of science, which is hysterical, because my editor will be like, do you want to do a story on gravitational waves, for example? And I'll be like, what's that? And Wikipedia is actually quite good as a starting point when you have no idea. You can't, trust it as the gospel, but it's a good place to start.
Thanks for your talk. I'm sort of asking this question on behalf of a friend who's a professor in the States, a professor of architecture, and we were talking about your sort of early renditions of your blog yesterday, and what we really liked was that you really brought together both food and architecture in ways that were really topical. And we wanted to know, of course, the refrigeration piece is very applicable, but we wanted to know if you had any other similar kinds of themes and topics in the future planned.
Well, the blog is the great sadness of my life, because I loved writing about those sorts of things, and thank you, that's lovely to hear. But now the New Yorker leaves and Gastropod leave me with no time to do anything, like barely even enough time to like get my hair cut and things. So it's you know, buy food, etc. So it's a bit of a nightmare. I do have the second book I'm working on, which is one of the reasons why I won't be rushing to try and sell a book on facts just yet, is co-authored with my husband, who's an architecture writer, and it's about quarantine. So that does have quite a spatial sort of feel to it too, and does tie together sort of architecture and public health, not food so much, but public health, although we do have an entire chapter on quarantine as it applies to agriculture, which is one of my favorite chapters. So there is a bit of that. But yeah, I need to become more efficient and do twice as much, at least.
Actually, just a note on that, we had Christy Cheng here last week speaking, who's an architect who's been looking at food, and one of the things that came out, and Nicola's been a visiting critic for her class at Harvard about food and architecture. A lot of the projects the students made in this graduate class didn't have quarantine sections, and that was one of the big changes all the students had to make to their projects. They learned that almost anything that dealt with food needed a separate
the minute you're moving crops, you have to quarantine them, yeah.
So yeah, good to know. Now we'll fix all that.
Do you have any approaches to dealing with supercharged subjects that might bring out cranks on either side? Do you avoid them? Do you just take some orthogonal route? Like I'm thinking, for instance, of GMOs.
Right. Yes, I am a little bit gun shy about these sorts of things, and I always I'm not very proud about this, but I try to avoid them. But that said, I do think, I mean, I have written, have I written about GMOs or only spoken? I gave a talk in Mexico City about GMOs, which it's a very charged issue in Mexico, because obviously corn, you know, is sort of this integral, essential part of the Mexican identity and landscape, and GMO corn is very controversial, obviously, and partly to do with the relationship between, you know, North America and Mexico, which is a power relationship and an unequal one at that. So it was a controversial topic there, but I think what I tried to say is that with GMOs, I feel like having the conversation from the point of view of are they bad for you or are they not, is very redundant. To me, it's much more interesting as what kind of environment is this fostering? What kind of, I mean, in fact, I'll just say this for all food and farming charged issues, whenever it separates into good and bad, essentially you've missed the point. There are good GMOs and there are bad GMOs. But it's more about what do they do within their ecosystem. So GMO Roundup Ready corn is promoting one kind of ecosystem, which is probably not a sustainable one, either economically or ecologically. GMO papayas in Hawaii are doing something different. So it's more how you use that technology and the context than that's. And now I'm just telling you my opinion rather than telling you I have a strategy. So basically, I don't have a strategy. Sorry. But I think, unfortunately, it's very hard to have a reasonable, or to even want to do this, because people get very upset and they're not willing to. It's very hard to want to write about it because people have fixed positions and don't want to listen. So it's very unrewarding as a writer or as a broadcaster to cover it, so I tend not to, which is chicken of me.
Hi, I'm a food historian, and I've been poking into lots of research and picking up odd details. One of the things I'm finding is that people's approach to food often includes really, really bizarre details. Like I came across a guy who around the turn of the century was trying dynamite fishing in Monaghan.
Nice.
Concluded it wasn't economically viable because the market price of the fish didn't match up to the cost of the dynamite to blow the fish out of the water.
Yeah.
But you get all kinds of strange stuff. What kind of things have you found in that bizarre line?
Well, dynamite fishing is good. There, I mean, the cow trials were, the bull trials were very bizarre. There's an awful lot of bizarre things out there. I mean, the Oreo was pretty bizarre. The Knights Templar connection, which is not really there. I really don't think. But I mean, you know, I think even, you know, I came across a random picture of a Cox's orange apple tree with the roots excavated. And that led me down a complete rabbit hole looking at rootstock. And it turns out that, you know, 80% of apples in the UK and Ireland are grown on just 2 rootstocks. And the rootstock shapes the shape of the tree. So it's sort of, you end up with these weird little snippets about how our food is grown or how it's farmed that people don't know about. There's a really good story about Antarctic food that I wrote about on Edible Geography that I now can't remember, but it was one of the weirdest ones I ever wrote. So this is the other problem, is I have a terrible memory, and once it's actually why I like writing, because at least then I can go back and look at it. This really makes me sound like a sad case, but otherwise it would be gone forever. So, I mean, it's funny. People will say to me, "Oh, I really liked your story about, you know, 18th century prostitutes in London." I'll be like, "Who wrote that? I didn't write that. I don't even know to take credit." And then I'll Google it and it'll come up. And I'll have the pleasure of reading it again and being like, I knew that once. So I think that's actually one of the reasons writing's most helpful for me. But yes, I love those kinds of stories. We should talk about dynamite fishing.
Do you know when you're researching or looking up ideas, do you know which will grab the public and which would be deemed successful articles or that? Or do you think that it's just your own opinion of this is really interesting to me?
I go with the latter, which is why I'm not an editor, I'm a writer. Then my editor will say to me, no one wants to read about the woman who's the top agricultural artist in the US, you know? And so I haven't written that story, which is sad, but she's the woman who paints all because, you know, you can order your sperm for your dairy cows, you know, and it's almost like a Tinder. They have descriptions and a picture, and she paints all the pictures of these bulls. And there's a particular pose, and you know, but she'll vary up the background and all of these. And I was like, oh, amazing. My editor was like, no, too niche. So I rely on an editor to tell me that, and then I have a blog for the things that aren't interesting enough. But yeah, some people have a really good sense for that. I tend not to, sadly. I think also, though, you can make a lot of things more interesting than they initially seem, or at least that's my hope. So again, refrigeration, not to bang on about it, but most people initially out of the door would be like, that's nice, next. And I try to point out that it's actually quite interesting. And, you know, when you look behind the scenes of these spaces, they're extremely weird. And, you know, we have these, you know, we're controlling their metabolism with all these weird gases that we pump in and air circulation and things like that, and we could change the color of bananas and oranges and anyway, and you know, it's changed the flavor of meat completely. So I try to get into all of these things and make it more interesting. But so you can make anything interesting, I think.
I have a quick question about audiences and media. So you showed us the New Yorker, which is old print publication, or it's been around for a long time. You did blogging, you've done podcasting. You showed us a quick thing working with the Center for Land Use Interpretation. So you're collaborating with artists. What is it that drives you to work across all these modes? And do you have a thought about like the audiences you're reaching through them? Does that come into your thinking, or is it just like you have too much energy? You're just directing it as much as.
It's a good question. I don't know. For example, I like the New Yorker audience. They're very smart people, and they're the kind of people who are willing to start in on a story about Chinese lingerie entrepreneurs on the basis that it's probably going to be interesting, you know? And so that really works well for me, because you'll start in on a story, give it the benefit of the doubt, and then hopefully, you know, stick with it. So I feel, you know, certain publications have trained their audience to expect certain things, and the New Yorker is one of those places that has trained its audience to go with this initially ridiculous premise that you're going to read 7,000 words on something extremely obscure and enjoy it. and so that works out quite well for me, and so I feel like I'm quite well suited to it. There are places that I've written for where I felt like I was completely not suited to what the audience is looking for. One of the nice things about having a podcast and a blog is you build an audience there, and that's kind of fun too, because you are training them in a way that makes me enjoy listening to the podcast. Now I'm training you. but you are sort of building, like the people who come back and like listening to that will go with you then to places that are a bit strange, you know, because they've stuck with you that far. So it's quite a fun business to build an audience like that. But like you say, then you partner and you get access to an entirely different audience and an entirely different way of thinking, and that, I think, keeps you fresh. So partnering at the Center for Land Use Interpretation, it's first of all, it was a chance for me to learn how they think. So, you know, one of the most fun things you can do is sort of steal someone else's way of working and try it on, and then you can keep the parts that work really well for you. So I deliberately, you know, wanted to work with Matt Coolidge, who's the head of the Center for Land Use Interpretation, so I could steal his way of thinking about the world and, you know, pull from it the parts that are exciting and see how he does what he does. So it was a deliberate, you know, sort of strategy on my part. Came up with sort of 6 ideas to pitch him and see if he wanted to work together. So that's kind of fun too.
Other questions?
I've talked so much, thank you.
It's like in my class, it's got to be at least 10 seconds. Or I'll start talking. And then, you know.
No one asked me how I make a living, which is, thank God. Bless you all. I wore my waterproof mascara deliberately so that if someone asked me, I didn't know that, and I broke down crying, it would be fine.
We usually have a microphone we can throw at you, but tonight, not so much.
Have you considered writing for children? Because most of them now think that actually food is just appears in the fridge and don't know where it comes from.
Huh. I don't think I have enough exposure to children to think to know what would be. I mean, that's a great question. I have to lurk at playgrounds. Get arrested. Maybe I'll borrow my brother's kids and see. But yeah, no, that's a great question. We do actually, one of the things that's funny is Gastropod has actually attracted quite a lot of kids in its audience. Parents listen with their kids, and we've had people write in saying they do, like they've done their science experiment in school based on something they've heard on gastropod and things. And so then that's been a bit, because there are moments in our episodes where people swear. We always talking about sex. So then we're a bit like, should we? I mean, we had a whole episode on aphrodisiacs, and then we were like, sorry, kids. So I don't know. I don't have kids, so I'm never the best judge of what's appropriate. I'm like, is this okay for a 13-year-old? I don't know. What are the 13-year-olds doing these days? But it has been an interesting thing for us that parents will say they listen with their kids, like on drives and things, and we're like, maybe we should rethink. But yeah.
Hi. No, I'm just wondering, has all the research you've done on food and agriculture and farming in this whole area, has it changed the way you eat yourself, or your own personal view on food, and does it inform the way you eat, or because you're always finding out new things, and anyway, just.
Yeah, I mean it has, and sometimes I have trepidation when we go into an episode if it's about something that I secretly know is probably actually a guilty pleasure, because it's like I don't want to know, because then I'll have to do something about it. Like our episode that just came out today about caffeine. I mean, caffeine is amazing. It's like a wonder drug. But, and so that made me feel good. I was like, well, you can caffeinate as much as you like. But synthetic caffeine, the kind that you'll find in, your Diet Coke or whatever, that is basically all made in China. And having toured a lot of those kinds of factories in China, I feel slightly differently now. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me that the caffeine would have to be made somewhere, and it would probably be made in China. But doing the research for this episode, we talked to a guy who had been to the largest caffeine factory in the world in China, and yeah, I haven't drunk Diet Coke since. So, which is hard going, I mean, you still have tea and coffee, and that's probably better for you anyway, but still, there are times where you want the carbonation. So yeah, it does. And then the other funny thing is, like, every episode we make, if it's about a specific thing, like, I end up absolutely eating tons of it. So we did our cheese episode, and it was all I could think about. I was just buying cheese. We did our ice cream episode. Suddenly, I didn't even eat ice cream that often. Suddenly, I had a freezer full of it. We're doing a citrus episode we're working on right now, out in a month. And I'm out buying, like, things that I never buy. I'm having grapefruit for breakfast, and, like, it really does, because you're just top of mind. But yeah, and it does, you can't not think about food more seriously once you know what goes into it. You have to rethink, it's unfortunate, but the knowledge is, it's a double-edged sword. Once you do know these things, you feel a little bit less good about some of them.
So I'm going to build on that one really quick, and then I'll give you the mic. Because I didn't mention explicitly that Nikki was one of our advisors for the field test exhibition that's up. And so she not only gave us input into the making of the show and the process, but actually helped put together one of the works. So up here in Gallery 4, we have a curated collection of scientist Richard Menken's recordings of food pests, which was one of my favorite episodes that you guys did of gastropods. I'm happy we brought it in. And I guess I just wanted to ask you about, so people come to the show being pretty stressed and maybe pessimistic about the future of farming, and I love that piece because maybe you could explain what the sound is, but there's also, you guys did an episode on endophytes, and we also have a thing here in the show about that. So I was wondering if all of this research, particularly on the farming side, has made you optimistic or pessimistic about the future overall of farming, and maybe you could tell us about the noise that's up in this gallery.
So the noise is it's USDA entomologist based in Florida, and he started out by trying to work out how to stop pests from eating all the stored mostly stored grains. So there can be as few as sort of 2 rice weevil larvae in a silo, and they reproduce so fast they'll just chomp through it, and you don't know that at the larval stage they're invisible. So you don't know they're in there until they've eaten it. So he made all these recordings of 17-day-old, rice weevil larvae and 18-day-old rice weevil larvae and things like that, and developed an entire sort of pest detector that you can put in the silos and will acoustically, look for a match. And if it finds the pest sound, now, oh my God, I have some 15-day-old rice weevil larvae eating my grain. Need to get out there. So now he's working on the biggest problem in Florida at the moment, which is citrus greening, HLB. It's wiping out the Florida orange juice industry. It's a bacteria that is carried by a psyllid, a little fly thing, and what he's done is record the sound of a horny lady fly, and she makes this like mooing sound. It's not actually that compelling, but if you're a male of these psyllids, you find it incredibly compelling, actually, and they can't resist it. That he plays this sound in the groves, and the men all come towards it and get caught in these traps. It's a sort of biopesticide, which is unfair and unfortunate, but is working out very well. And given that otherwise it's sort of there's no cure for this, they're trying lots of very strong chemicals, which are not then very good for everything else that lives in the orange groves, let alone us. It's quite an interesting method that he's having some success with. So yes, do I feel optimistic? I think we can come up with all the right solutions. It's whether the incentives exist for us to use them is the slight problem. So I feel very optimistic that we can do it. I feel less optimistic that, trade and economics is set up to incentivize that, sadly.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful talk. I feel like what you write about seems to be very multifaceted, but food is like a kind of thread through a lot of it. It takes in so many different things. But I feel as well like food has become a topic that's increasingly popular across all media. And I wonder if that's something that you think as well, and if so, why? And with publications like The New Yorker, is that a strategy that they have? Like when they look into the future, do they plan for more writing about food? Do they seek it out? Or is it something that's kind of popular now but might decrease in future?
That's a really good question, yeah. So I started my blog in 2009, and food was already quite popular then, but not as popular. And then I felt a bit embarrassed to be writing a food blog, because I felt a bit like, oh, it's a food blog, it's so girly, like it's not serious. And this I hear actually a lot from food historians, that they weren't taken seriously by fellow historians as sort of legit researchers, because it's food, it's sort of this light topic, not serious. And so I suffered from that prejudice too, I will admit it. But obviously it's not true. And then over the years since I've been writing edible geography, food has only become more and more of a thing and more popular. The New Yorker is a funny one. I don't know what their strategy is. I mean, when they hired me, they were like, oh, we want more food writing. And then most of the time they have me write about, physics, which is not my strength, believe me. They seemed to think that they wanted more food writing, but they didn't actually, or haven't yet followed through on that. I mean, I wrote one piece for their food issue, and they do have 2 food issues a year. They've had those for a while, but there isn't much food writing in the rest of the year, or online. I don't know why. And podcast-wise, it's also interesting. There's actually not as many food podcasts as you would think. You know, and the ones that are often cooking specifically. I mean, that's the thing with food media. It often gets sort of lumped into recipes and cooking, which is great. I have nothing against recipes and cooking, and I like both things, and I like eating. But that's not the only way to talk about food, obviously. So, yeah, I would like to, I mean, I don't know if it's going to it is a fad, definitely. I don't know if it's going to carry on being a fad. I hope so. I think one of the things that's most exciting is I feel like a whole generation sort of forgot about flavor being an important thing. And now everyone thinks about the taste of things. And when you think about the taste of things, well, then you're not happy with like the pathetic supermarket apple, and you want a good apple, you know, and you're not happy. So, you know, with the like flavorless lump of chicken that came on your supermarket, you know, so discovering flavor is actually a great, great thing. And I actually, as obnoxious as all those kind of foodie things are, I actually think they make me very optimistic for the future.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, if anyone has any left.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
I've been talking for hours.
Apologies for not being familiar with gastropod previously, but have you covered Soylent or its equivalents? And do you have any thoughts on it?
Yes, we haven't really. So when we started Gastropod, we tried to be a bit more realistic about what we were doing, and we did one long episode and one short episode every 2 weeks. Now we're just doing one long episode every 2 weeks, and it is killing us. But one of our short episodes, we did talk about Soylent because I had just lived on it for a week for an article that I wrote for Eon magazine, which is an online science publication. And I was actually saying to some of the people here at the start, it was the best diet I've ever been on. I lost 1/2 stone in a week. I could not be, like, it was so much more compelling to go to bed hungry than to drink another glass of Soylent. But, and I mean, you make a big jug at the start of the day, and then it separates out into this like bubbly, spongy top, this sort of cloudy brown liquid, and then the sludge at the bottom, absolutely minging. And then it tastes pretty much as you would imagine. And yeah, I mean, I have lots of opinions about Soylent that were in the article too. I mean, I think it's absolutely ridiculous that we would imagine that we could reverse engineer food. We have no idea all of there's something like 40 to 50,000, you know, different chemicals going on in a food metabolome, and those are interacting then with our own human metabolome, and those interactions are not understood. I mean, scientists are beginning to map those out. You know, the metabolomics is this very emerging field, looking at how those different chemicals interact with each other. And it's not like we just eat one thing at a time and then it just interacts with our body, which would already be complicated enough. You know, we're having a squeeze of lemon juice on the fish, which is on a bed of something, and all of those chemicals are then interacting with each other and us. And so we have no idea. I mean, you know, the few things that have been charted sort of show these immensely complicated relationships between if you eat this with this, and your body is producing this particular type of chemical, then it leads to inflammation. You know, and so the thought that you can just make a powder that contains everything and your body will be fine, it's ridiculous. And like, I mean, in the article there are two things. One was looking at the founder of Soylent's microbiome, you know, the microbes living in his gut, and he had those examined, and they were unusual, to say the least. And then the other thing that is quite funny is, you know, this dental sort of archaeologist was sort of saying, what's this going to do to our jaws? you can already trace sort of the impact that eating less meat and so on and cooking has had on our facial structure. And he had this whole idea that, in the future, if we do all move on to liquid nutrition, we'll have something called Soylent face, which will basically be like, imagine the most pronounced underbite that you've ever seen. Like your jaw, your chin is basically gone. That's the least of the problems with Soylent. The first problem is that it tastes disgusting. And then the second problem is, what are the efficiencies around it? Like, let's look into the energy it takes to make this product and bring it all together. And then the third, well, there's so many problems. I have a lot of problems with Soylent. And these, all of them. And we mentioned bulletproof coffee in our latest caffeine episode, which is another one that these like biohacker self-optimization people love. It's where you put a chunk of grass-fed butter in your coffee. And it is, there's nothing wrong. Grass-fed butter is great. Coffee is great. Two great things that don't actually taste that great together. But if you want to have them that way, that's fine. But the science behind it is non-existent. All of these kind of Silicon Valley guys who think they have solved food.
And on that note, so we don't want to solve food. We want to enjoy it.
Yes.
I'm glad you brought up flavor at the end. If you guys could just help thank Nicola for coming again.
Thank you guys. These were great questions.
She'll probably just hang around here for a minute up front and any questions you couldn't ask in front of the camera. And do enjoy the field test exhibition. And we're really grateful for your input in putting it together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.